They smiled at funerals. They nursed the sick. They opened their homes to strangers. And one by one, the people who trusted them stopped waking up. No one suspects the woman crying at the graveside. No one questions the wife who nurses her husband through his final fever. No one watches the hostess pouring tea a second time. That is exactly why these 5 women got away with it. For as long as they did, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, sometimes long enough to bury an entire family before a single doctor asked the right question. 5 women, 5 different countries, nearly a century and a half between the first case and the last. A stepmother who reached for acid. A wife who reached for rat poison over and over for 19 years. A mother who reached for arsenic until there was almost no one left to poison. A mistress who reached for a pistol over a dinner she cooked herself. And a widow who tended her own family's grave every single day, the same grave she had filled herself, one small coffin at a time. Different centuries, different countries, different weapons. But every one of them shares the same signature. They didn't kill strangers. They killed the people who loved them, fed them, married them, and never once saw it coming. This is the story of the women who turned love, trust, and family into weapons. Case 1. Louise Peete. A grand jury acquitted her once. A jury sentenced her to life the second time. It still wasn't enough to stop her. Louise Peete was born Lophie Louise Preslar in Bienville, Louisiana in 1880, the daughter of a wealthy, socially prominent newspaper publisher. She was educated at some of the finest private schools in New Orleans, until she was expelled for what the records politely called inappropriate behavior. She would later tell reporters she came from cultured, educated people, a line she repeated for the rest of her life, even from behind bars. Her first husband, a traveling salesman named Henry Bosley, took his own life in 1907 after finding her in bed with another man. It was a pattern that would follow her for the next 4 decades. The men in Louise Peete's orbit had a habit of not surviving her. In 1912, in Waco, Texas, a diamond dealer named Joe Appel met a beautiful young woman who called herself Louise. Just 1 week after they met, Appel was found, shot dead, his diamond jewelry gone. Louise told the jury he had tried to assault her, that she'd only fired to defend herself. The all-male jury believed every word. They acquitted her. According to reports from the courtroom that day, they actually applauded the verdict. It was the first of at least 3 men in Louise Peete's life who ended up dead, and the first time a jury let her walk. In 1913, Louise moved to Dallas and married a hotel night clerk named Harry Forot. Not long after the wedding, $20,000 in jewels vanished from the hotel safe. Police suspected her immediately but could never prove it. Forot, humiliated by the theft and by his wife's open infidelities, took his own life not long after. Though even at the time, some detectives quietly wondered if that suicide had help. It was the second man connected to Louise Peete to die that way, and it would not be the last time. Before she ever reached Los Angeles, Louise had already reinvented herself once. In Boston, she took the name Louise M. Gould and posed as a runaway Dallas heiress who had escaped a convent. Wealthy families took her in out of sympathy. She charged their accounts at the city's most expensive stores and quietly stole from their friends and staff, until her real identity surfaced, and police simply asked her to leave town rather than embarrass the families she'd conned. By 1920, she was living in Los Angeles under the name Mrs. Peete, and she had a new target, Jacob Denton, a wealthy mining engineer. Denton let her stay in his Catalina Street mansion. Weeks later, he vanished. Louise told police he had run off with another woman. She kept living in his house, wearing his dead wife's furs, spending his money, until his daughter grew suspicious and hired a private detective. They found Jacob Denton's body buried in the basement. He had been shot, then strangled to make certain. When detectives finally tracked Louise down in Denver, she offered them several different explanations for how Denton had died, each one changing as the last one fell apart. Louise Peete was convicted of first-degree murder in 1921 and sentenced to life. She served 18 years. She was paroled in 1939 into the care of a kind, wealthy couple named Arthur and Margaret Logan, who took her in out of pure charity. In May 1944, Margaret Logan disappeared. Louise told neighbors she had gone to a sanitarium. She told Arthur's family the same lie for months, forging letters in Margaret's handwriting. 6 months later, police dug up the backyard. Margaret Logan's body was found in a shallow grave, shot in the back of the head, her skull crushed. Louise blamed Arthur Logan for the murder, claiming she had only buried the body out of fear she'd be blamed. Arthur was arrested too, then released for lack of evidence. But the accusation and the pressure of the case followed him regardless. He later took his own life. It made him the third man in Louise Peete's orbit to die by his own hand, on top of the two she had killed outright. Louise Peete was sentenced to death. Even on death row, awaiting execution at San Quentin, she gave interviews maintaining her innocence in both killings, composed and defiant to the end. On April 11, 1947, she became only the second woman ever executed in California's gas chamber. She was 66 years old. 3 men who committed suicide around her. 1 acquittal with applause. 1 18-year sentence that taught her nothing. And a woman who was kind enough to save her from prison, buried in her own garden. But Louise Peete used a gun and a shovel. Our next woman never needed either. All she needed was a spoon. Case 2. Rhonda Belle Martin. A paralyzed man in a Mississippi. Hospital bed was the only reason anyone ever found out. Rhonda Belle Tomley was born in Alabama in 1906 and grew up to become a heavyset, unremarkable waitress in Montgomery, the kind of woman neighbors described as pleasant, quiet, and easy to overlook. That was precisely the point. Over 19 years, she buried her own mother. She buried 2 husbands. She buried 3 of her own daughters, all under the age of 12. Each time, she collected a small insurance payout. Just enough, investigators later noted, to cover the funeral. Never more. It was one of the strangest details of the entire case. If she was killing for money, she was doing it for almost none. According to a Life magazine report at the time, Martin loved the attention that followed each death. The get-well cards while they were sick, the sympathy cards once they were gone. She had them buried side by side in a private plot she visited often. Her weapon never changed. Rat poison, laced quietly into food and coffee, delivered in small enough doses that each death looked like nothing more than a lingering illness. The pattern stretched back nearly 2 decades. In 1937, her 3-year-old daughter, Emma Jean Garrett, died. In 1939, her second husband, George Garrett, died the same way. In 1940, 6-year-old Anna Carolyn Garrett followed. Later came Ellen Elizabeth Garrett, another daughter, dead before the age of 12. Each death was quiet. Each death looked natural. Each death came with a small check from an insurance company, never large enough to raise suspicion, exactly large enough to bury them. In 1951, she poisoned her 4th husband, Claude Carroll Martin, feeding him arsenic incrementally until his body gave out. 8 months after burying him, she married his son, her own former stepson, a man named Ronald Martin. Ronald became husband number 5, and Ronald became her first survivor. In early 1956, Ronald was hospitalized with violent cramps and creeping paralysis. He lived, but he never walked again. His illness was the thread that finally unraveled everything. Doctors traced arsenic in his system, investigators exhumed Claude Martin's body, and the toxicology came back lethal. Under 3 days of questioning, including polygraph-assisted sessions, Rhonda Belle Martin confessed in detail to 6 poisonings, describing exactly how she'd purchased rat poison locally and worked it into meals over time. She later tried to walk back her confession on 2 of her children's deaths, but the rest she never denied. At trial, her defense argued she was legally insane, presenting a theory of schizophrenia to explain 19 years of methodical, undetected killing. The jury didn't buy it. A jury of 12 men took less than an hour to convict her. Prison officials knew she had a weak heart, So they deliberately kept her execution date from her until the very last days, afraid the shock alone might kill her first. On October 11, 1957, she was executed in Alabama's electric chair, clutching a New Testament in her left hand. Before she died, she asked that her body be donated to medical science, so that doctors, she said, might finally learn why I committed the crimes I have committed. She remains, to this day, the last woman ever executed in the state of Alabama, a record that would stand for the next 45 years. A mother who buried 5 of her own family members and kept the get-well cards. But at least Rhonda Belle Martin's victims never saw it coming. Our next woman's stepdaughter watched her load the weapon. Here is something worth pausing on. For most of history, poison was called a woman's weapon. Not because women were more inclined to kill, but because poison required none of the physical strength a knife or a gun demanded. It required patience, proximity, and access to a kitchen. It let a killer stand in the same room as her victim, serve them dinner, and walk away looking like a grieving widow instead of a murderer. That is exactly what made women like Rhonda Belle Martin and, later, Martha Needle so difficult to catch. There was no break-in, no struggle, no weapon to trace. Just a slow decline that doctors, in an era before easy toxicology testing, were happy to blame on stomach illness, typhoid, or simple bad luck. But not every woman on this list had that kind of patience. Some of them wanted their victims to know, in their final moments, exactly whose hands had done it. Case 3. Martha Place. She was the first woman in American history to die in the electric chair. What she did to get there was almost too brutal to print in 1898. Martha Place married a widower named William Place in 1893, brought in originally as a housekeeper to help raise his teenage daughter, Ida. It was never a happy home. Neighbors said Martha was jealous of the girl. William had called the police on his own wife once already, after she threatened to kill his daughter. On the evening of February 7, 1898, the two women argued. Ida slammed a door in Martha's face. According to Martha's own police statement, that was enough. She grabbed a bottle of acid from William's photography desk and threw it directly into 17-year-old Ida's face and eyes. Then, while the girl was still alive, Martha piled bedding on top of her and smothered her to death. She wasn't finished. Martha found an axe in the cellar and waited by the front door. When William Place walked in from work that evening, his wife was standing there with the axe raised. She struck him in the head again and again, hard enough to fracture his skull, but William broke free, stumbled into the street, and screamed for help. When police arrived, they found William bleeding on the sidewalk. Upstairs, they found Ida's body, her face burned beyond recognition. Downstairs, they found Martha semi-conscious on the floor. She'd turned on every gas jet in the house, trying to kill herself once her plan had failed. At trial, Martha Place claimed provocation, not premeditation, that a slammed door and a violent quarrel that morning had driven her to it. On the witness stand, she was asked where she had obtained the concentrated acid, how long she had kept it, and why its original bottle had disappeared from the house entirely. She refused to answer any of it. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. Guilty, no mercy recommended. Her lawyers appealed directly to New York's brand-new governor, Theodore Roosevelt. It was one of the very first decisions to land on his desk after taking office. He ordered doctors to examine her mental state, then refused to intervene. This murder was one of peculiar deliberation and atrocity, he wrote. There is but one course open to me. I decline to interfere with the course of the law. On March 20th, 1899, Martha Place was strapped into Singh's electric chair, the first woman in history to face it. Prison officials, who had only ever prepared the chair for men, weren't sure how to attach the electrodes through her long hair, or how to preserve her modesty while doing it. They ultimately slit her dress at the ankle instead. The prison's own physician would later call it the best execution that has ever occurred here. Witnesses said she died instantly. An acid attack, a smothering, and an axe, all before dinner. If you think that's the most disturbing scene in this list, wait until you hear what happened under a Bermondsey kitchen floor. If this documentary has you locked in already, subscribe now, because the next two cases are even darker and we're only halfway through. Case 4. Maria Manning. The dinner invitation was the murder weapon. The guest just didn't know it yet. Maria Manning, born Maria de Roux in Switzerland, was a striking, ambitious domestic servant who had worked her way into the grand households of Victorian London, at one point accompanying her wealthy employers on trips across Europe. It was on one such trip in 1846 that she met Patrick O'Connor, a wealthy customs officer and moneylender nearly twice her age, known for charging extraordinary interest on his loans and quietly amassing a fortune because of it. She had two suitors, O'Connor and a mild-mannered railway guard named Frederick Manning, who claimed he was due a large inheritance from his mother's estate. Maria chose the inheritance. She married Frederick in May 1847 at St. James's Church, Piccadilly. The inheritance never came. It had never existed at all. But Patrick O'Connor's fortune was very real, and even after her marriage, Maria kept him close, continuing an affair with her husband's quiet knowledge. O'Connor became a regular dinner guest at their home on Miniver Place in Bermondsey, welcomed by both of them as though nothing unusual was happening at all. By the summer of 1849, Maria had made up her mind. She had picked the wrong man to marry, and there was still time to correct the mistake, not by leaving Frederick, but by finally taking what O'Connor had. If she couldn't have his money through marriage, she would have it another way. Her husband, weak-willed and dominated by her, agreed to help. She and Frederick dug a shallow grave beneath their own kitchen flagstones and covered it with a thick layer of quicklime. On August 9, 1849, they invited Patrick O'Connor to dinner one final time. As O'Connor stood at the basin to wash his hands before the meal, Maria stepped up behind him and shot him point-blank in the back of the head. The pistol wasn't powerful enough to kill him outright, so Frederick finished the job, beating him to death with a crowbar. They buried him under their own kitchen floor and went back to living in the house above him. The next morning, Maria walked to O'Connor's lodgings as though nothing had happened and calmly stole his railway shares and cash, the same visit she had made countless times before as his friend. When O'Connor failed to turn up for days afterward, friends reported him missing. A week later, police searching his known associates noticed a damp, freshly disturbed stone in the Mannings' kitchen floor, with the earth around it noticeably softer than the rest. They lifted it. Underneath was Patrick O'Connor's decomposing body, and beside it, a blood-stained dress that belonged to Maria. By then, both Mannings had already vanished. Maria fled north to Edinburgh under a false name, checking into one of the city's finer hotels, as though she were simply a wealthy traveler. She was tracked down using one of the era's newest inventions, the electric telegraph, which police used to alert their Scottish counterparts within hours instead of days, and was arrested in her hotel room. Frederick, meanwhile, was found separately, hiding on the Isle of Jersey. The trial in October 1849 drew enormous public attention. The evidence, prosecutors said, was overwhelming. The jury needed just 45 minutes to convict both Mannings. Maria Manning howled at the court as she was sentenced, telling the judge, "You have treated me like a wild beast of the forest." On November 13, 1849, she and Frederick were hanged together on the roof of Horsemonger Lane Jail, the first husband and wife, executed together in England in nearly 150 years. The novelist Charles Dickens stood in the crowd that morning, and the horror of what he witnessed would later shape one of literature's most infamous villains. A dinner invitation, a shallow grave under the kitchen floor, and a killer who kept visiting the crime scene to steal from the man, buried beneath it. But our final case takes us to Australia, where one woman turned grief itself into a disguise and buried 3 of her own children before anyone thought to ask why. Case 5. Martha Needle. They called her the Black Widow of Richmond. She earned it one small coffin at a time. Martha Needle was born Martha Charles in 1863 near Morgan, South Australia, into a poor and violent household. By her own family's later accounts, she endured a harsh, abusive childhood, including, according to court records, an assault by her own stepfather when she was just 11 years old, an incident serious enough that he was imprisoned for it. She left home young and went into domestic service, where by all accounts she was known as beautiful, charming, and quietly unstable. At 17, she married a young carpenter named Henry Needle in Adelaide. The couple settled in the Melbourne suburb of Richmond and had 3 daughters, Mabel, Elsie, and May. To the outside world, they looked like a happy, well-matched young family. Behind closed doors, neighbors began to notice that Martha was spending more and more time away from the house, unaccompanied by her husband. In 1885, Mabel died suddenly after a short illness. In 1889, Henry died too, leaving Martha a small life insurance payout. In December 1890, 6-year-old Elsie died. In August 1891, 4-year-old May followed her sisters. Within 6 years, Martha Needle had buried her entire immediate family, a husband and all 3 of her own children, and collected an insurance payment after every single death. She used the money to build her family an elaborate grave. Neighbors said she visited it almost daily, tending flowers, mourning publicly, playing the part of the devastated widow so convincingly that no one looked closer. She moved on. She took in lodgers at her home on Bridge Road, including 2 brothers, Otto and Louis Junkin, who ran a saddlery next door. Martha began an affair with Otto and the 2 planned to marry. But Otto's brothers, Louis and Herman, disapproved and tried to talk him out of it. In 1894, Louis Junkin fell ill after eating a meal Martha had prepared. He died within weeks, ruled at first as typhoid. His brother Herman traveled from Adelaide to settle Louis's affairs. He ate lunch at Martha's table. He fell violently ill with cramps. He recovered and fell ill again the very next day, after eating another meal she had made. A doctor, growing suspicious, took a sample of Herman's vomit and sent it for analysis. It came back positive for arsenic. While Herman lay sick and unaware he had been poisoned, Martha invited his sister, Emma Jones, over for tea. Herman warned her not to go. She didn't. It may have saved her life. Investigators exhumed the bodies of Martha's husband and all 3 of her children. Every one of them showed traces of arsenic. Martha Needle was tried only for the murder of Louis Junkin. The case authorities could prove beyond doubt. The jury took just 40 minutes to convict her. She never confessed to killing her own children, and to this day, no clear motive was ever established for those deaths. She had not yet met Otto, was not desperate for money at the time, and gained comparatively little from each small policy. Throughout her 4-day trial in the Supreme Court of Victoria, Martha Needle maintained a striking composure. Witnesses described her walking out of the dock each day, unassisted, with firm step and unblanched face, not the demeanor anyone expected from a woman, accused of poisoning her own family. Otto Junkin, still hoping to save her, visited Martha in jail regularly and wrote to his own mother that he prayed Martha would be proved to be insane, and therefore not responsible for her misdeeds. The court disagreed. On October 22, 1894, 30-year-old Martha Needle was hanged at the old Melbourne jail, one of only 4 women ever executed there. In a final letter to Otto, written the night before she died, she told him not to grieve, that he should think of her waiting for him in a happy home with my loved ones. She left her entire estate, worth barely £25, to the man she had never gotten the chance to poison. Otto went on to marry another woman, have 6 children, and live a long, unremarkable life, the one member of her circle she never touched. A husband, 3 children, a brother-in-law, and a woman who tended their grave every single day as if she hadn't put them there herself. It's worth stepping back for a moment. Between Martha Place's execution in 1899 and Rhonda Belle Martin's in 1957, forensic science changed almost beyond recognition. Toxicology testing became routine. Autopsies grew far more thorough. Arsenic and rat poison, once nearly untraceable, became some of the easiest poisons for a coroner to detect. And yet it still took a paralyzed son-in-law, a suspicious doctor, or a nosy relative to actually catch these women, not the system itself. That's the uncomfortable thread running through all 5 of these cases. It was never clever detective work that ended them. It was luck or a survivor, or a family member who simply refused to let a strange pattern of deaths go unquestioned. Louise Peete was caught because a daughter hired her own investigator. Martha Needle was caught because one brother happened to warn his sister not to go to tea. Change one small detail in any of these 5 stories, and every one of these women might have kept going. 5 women, 5 centuries. One pattern: they never hunted strangers. They waited at home, trusted by the very people they killed. A husband, a stepdaughter, a friend, even their own child. Ida Place was 17. Martha Needle's daughters never saw 6. They're not footnotes. They're victims who deserve to be remembered. So remember them, share their stories, and watch closely, because evil rarely knocks as a stranger. It usually already has a key to your house and a seat at your table. If this kept you watching till the end, subscribe. The next one's darker.